Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Spiegler, Global Director of Art Basel, and I'm here to welcome you to the first of many conversations this week. It's a very, very full schedule. It's the first schedule done with under the advisement of Julieta Aranda, and it's very topical in the sense that we have everything from talks about ecology to the issues of being a mother in the art world, the gender price gap. We have a sound performance by the Calicut Library. Of course, you won't be able to make it to all of this, but luckily for you, and for us, and for me, who never sees enough of these, it's all going to be captured and put online. So you can watch it in the comfort of your own home in a quieter week. I know you didn't come out to see me. You came out to see William Kentridge and Josef Helfenstein. So without further ado, I will wish you a great week. I hope you can make it to many of the talks here, and I look forward to seeing what these two great men of the art world have to share with us this morning. Thank you very much to both of you for being here, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you who got up early on a Wednesday morning to come and see this. Have a great week. Have a great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, William, for spending more than usual days with us in Basel on several occasions. And why don't we just start with not just a work, but also a topic that is central to William Kentridge's practice. This is a shot taken from a studio, but it's also a new piece created for this show that is not in the main part of the exhibition, which is at the Kunstmuseum Basel Gegenwart, but it's sort of integrated into the 20th century collection, which is really strong, as many of you know. So next to this piece, it's a short film, is a work by Schwitters, a beautiful small collage, almost like Dada piece by Picasso, and a Paul Klee painting. And so this is called Learning from the Old Masters. It's one of the drawing lessons, a film series that William has started in 2009.
Good. Thank you, Joseph. And just to kick it off, the talk this morning is very much in the context of the exhibition that Joseph has curated at the Kunstmuseum, both in the big building and in the Gegenwart down the hill. And when we were doing the exhibition, he said, could I imagine doing a piece for this event, for the exhibition in Basel? And this is one of a series of short films made which have the kind of the format that is common is the replication, the doubling of myself in the films. And this is, of course, possible with simple editing techniques where you simply fix the camera and then split it and film yourself twice. And these are always filmed alone in my studio late at night, so no one else can see the stupidity of the activity. And maybe we'll come back to the studio later also to talk about the importance of the studio as a safe space for stupidity, which is vital. It's not to say it's the same as a psychoanalytic space, but there are echoes which are the same of being a space for free association, for giving a whim and uncertainty the benefit of the doubt, and seeing what that becomes. Much as if you're talking to an analyst, you would allow anything to emerge and see what came out of it, rather than thinking, am I saying something intelligent? So it's not to say one of these is the patient and the other is the analyst, but there's generally speaking a kind of conflict between the two people talking. It's a project which has been going for 10 years, and it works partly as a diary of what's been happening in the studio and what's the background of these films, and it works partly as a kind of long-term self-portrait, trying to understand. And this is about the man on your left, who's always somewhat irritated, asking what on earth this man on the right, on your left, on my left, on your right, thinks he's doing in this museum with all these great old masters. And it comes partly from, it is still astonishing, even though I've been making pictures for decades, to be shown in the company of those astonishing works that are in museums like the Kunstmuseum Basel, to be allowed to sit quietly in the room next to a Grunewald or next to the Picasso or the Paul Klee is astonishing. And I kind of have to think of it, the way I have to think of it is almost as if thinking this is being said to my 18-year-old self. If I'd said to myself as an art student when I was 18-year-old, just have patience, just keep working and have patience, and eventually you're going to end up over there. I would not have believed it for one moment, even though obviously that's what one imagines in one's head. But it also refers to something that I'm sure we'll come back to later in talking about the studio, and that is the split of the artist. And it's something that's very clear in the studio because of the way the studio practice works, but it's a phenomenon that is not restricted to the studio, but illuminates many other things outside. I'm sure in the studio you have the difference between when you're at the wall making the drawing, when you're very close and you kind of know where the mark should go, and then you turn and you step and you look back and you become a completely different person. So the one is the artist as maker and the other is the artist as viewer. And the artist as viewer is consistently disappointed with that idiot, the artist as maker, who can't see. It's so obvious that when he's done the drawing that it's in the wrong place. He's put the arm in the wrong place. How can he still get that wrong? And there's that kind of, I'm sure people who've done writing, you write something at night and you think this really sounds great, and in the morning you reread it and you say, what idiot wrote that? Not me, I could never do that. So that's kind of the conversations, which is what you do. The activity of making a mark and turning to look at it is enacting that split that we have all the time. So the sense of the studio being a place where you demonstrate the process of deconstructing the world or putting it into fragments here, splitting the self into two, and then putting back together is a kind of automatic process of the studio, but which sometimes can also be illuminating of other processes that we all have outside of the studio.
Well, you mentioned the psychoanalyst and the patient. So this relationship between, in a way, they both don't know. They don't have the truth. None of them, not even the psychiatrist. So isn't the space you mentioned, and you just did it? You walked. You walked from here to there, and you drew, and that's kind of how your work develops. So. Even the and of course the split character of the artist, which we all know, and the Dadaists and all Schwitters, whose piece you have just performed, they made this a main theme of their own work. This kind of extreme self-reflection of the art and the constant doubting of what one does. So. What's not you haven't mentioned yet, and we don't want to get stuck here, but is, of course, there's Rasmus von Rotterdam there, painted famously by Holbein, which is a painting we have in our collection, and which if you haven't seen it, you have made a big mistake so far, but you can correct it. There's Erasmus wrote a famous piece, which you probably know, which is called In Praise of Folly, Lob der Torheit, in 1509, and in 1515 there was the third edition was done here in Basel. Basel was an important place for printing, and of course Lob der Torheit, In Praise of Folly, it's famous. It's surprisingly one of the best, most read piece of world literature. So, and I think it describes kind of the state of the world, no? In Praise of Folly. That's how we live in now. If you look at politics and everything, we live in a complete state of folly. But folly is also a very productive kind of ground for creating work. No?
I mean, I'm not an expert on Erasmus's In Praise of Folly, although the one person in the film starts reading the Latin as a defense against the attack from the other. But I think what it does do, it very early on, as you say, in when did he write? 1509, uses ridicule, satire, and the absurd as a form of thinking about serious questions. And that, for me, is vital. I mean, one of the results of living in South Africa for all those decades under apartheid was to understand the absurd as a central category of understanding the world. And the absurd is not the same as the stupid or the funny. The absurd is when you have something going wrong in a logic, a perversion of logic. In South Africa's case, the racial classifications we had under the nationalist government, and then you carry that through to the nth degree, and then you are in a state that is both absurd and true and tragic. And that, I suppose, gave me that's a fundamental reason for belief in the absurd as an important category, much more than the solo tragic. So in some ways, how do you deal with great questions of world history? And the one solution very often used is to reduce it to the story of one person and to follow their narrative and to find their tragic flaw and to follow them through it. And that's the way we take the single figure to represent a huge world process. But the absurd gives you a chance of working in a very different way. The absurd and the collage, which you spoke about, fragmentation. And I mean, the collage is a common. I feel much standing.
Yeah, yeah.
The collage is not a 20th century phenomenon in the sense that all artists have used collage as a technique. If you think of the Caspar David Friedrich landscapes with the monks and the trees standing. He had sketchbooks of all details of pine trees, and when he came to do a painting, he'd go through those and find a branch from this tree and a stem from that tree and a hut from there, and he'd construct what appears to be a coherent landscape from these fragments. The difference comes, I think, from both Picasso, you see in the fantastic Cubist Picasso exhibition in the Kunstmuseum, but also particularly with the Dadasts, when this fragmentation gets celebrated in itself. We understand the world is fragmented, and there's a kind of energy that comes from it, and a celebration of that, and making the collage the point, to say that coherence is always a construction rather than a discovery. And that's, of course, what you do naturally as an artist in your studio. All studios are filled with things pinned up on the wall, finished works, postcards, photostats, letters that have been written as the visible things around you. And then, of course, all the other things that are other fragments that exist, like thoughts in your head, memories, dreams, all of these. And all of these fragments come together to be reconstructed, to make a whole. And so I think that sense, the fragment becomes, and the collage, which is how we always construct our lives anyway. At the end of the morning, we get up and we say, okay, I've got to remake myself every day. Of all the different things that you could say, you construct one thing that you do say. So it's that sense of provisional coherence, which could be different, but which is constructed into a provisional and temporary coherence, is how we go through the world and how we work in the studio.
Yeah. Prefer to stand?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. This is a view from the studio. So there is actually a space in the show, and it's a little bit like the heart of the show, William, no? In a way. Yeah. There is a space in a room in the show at the Gegenwart that is called studio. So it is like the studio that William is the sort of the heart of whatever he produces. And maybe one thing that you have mentioned, but I have a kind of a question. This the abundance. There's lots of pieces, lots of different things in that studio, but there is something the way you use overabundance is something that I have not seen with other artists in this way. And I wonder, it's the way you master all these different mediums, these different, theater and film and drawing and sculpture and almost any technique you can think of. Is it also a way for you to deal with the kind of the complexity of the world?
No, I think the complexity of the world becomes an excuse for justifying the excess that is there in the studio of itself. So, I mean, I think there are, with writers and with artists, you get some people whose motivation is a burning story they have to tell. Mm-hmm. This happened to me, and it's important that I tell everyone what happened, and that becomes the novel, or that becomes... But there are other people in which I would place myself where it's much less coherent. There's a kind of a need to be in the studio, a need to be making, and what it is that is made is in a way secondary to the object. I mean, I think that all artists are inadequate. I mean, if you're a coherent and adequate human being, there's no need to have to constantly leave a trail behind you as you go through life, saying to people, look at this, I exist. Here's another piece of paper to show that I exist. You're just there and you can get on with your life and that's fine. So there is a kind of strangeness of this need to leave the snail trail behind you as you go through. And that for me, that's the starting point. And then it finds different subjects which are also bubbling inside, different themes that need to come out, questions that are in the air. And for me, the great opening in the studio is when I thought, all right, let's take that as a given and not feel it has to have a kind of Leninist view of what are the images that the world needs, that it has to have. What are the, who is needing what image to change the world? And when that disappeared, it became much easier to work in a way that was open to find the things that were interesting, that in a strange way are much more reflective of the world than the early works that I'd done.
Yeah. So as we can see right now, William's walking kind of, I mean, you used the term foot power. Statt Pferdestärke, Menschenstärke, foot power. Fuß power is a key element and kind of almost like the motor it helps at least. I mean, you have the hand, you have your incredible talent to draw, and of course the brain is making decisions, but the feet are contributing in a very unusual way. And of course Paul Klee, and you quote him, wrote this famous piece used this famous beautiful poetic term, taking a line on a walk, eine Linie auf einen Spaziergang mitnehmen. And that's kind of what you do, no?
I mean, there's so many things about, I read that line from, or I'd heard about that line from Paul Klee, but it was a mishearing. I'd mistaken line for lion, Linie for a Löwe. So taking a lion for a walk. And I thought, that's such a great image of drawing. You've got this animal and you never know if it's going to turn on you. And you never know if you're taking it for a walk or if it's leading you. So that became an interesting, just to think sideways from that. It is about the walking, but in terms of the walking that happens in the studio, it's very much the walking of a cat and not of a dog. So one of the things that Paul Klee, when he writes his piece about taking a lion for a walk, he never mentioned that a lion is always a cat and a point, because he writes, a point is a dog. To draw, if you draw any line and you however florid it is, it's the spine of a cat that can turn in on itself, its tail moves, and you can just add rough charcoal marks to it and you're animating a cat walking. A dog, on the other hand, is always just, so a cat is its spine, a dog is always just its nose. So it's where its nose is looking. And then maybe you give it a tail to at the end. So it's like an arrow, it's like a vector. So the cat and the dog. So between that, you can both have a kind of animation, you can make a kind of performance between one character on stage, that's the cat that has a way of talking as a cat, is indifferent to what's happening. And dogs are always extremely stupid. They're always just, we are, oh yes, okay. And the cat says, well, you can say what you like, but I'm off somewhere else. It's of no interest to me at all. So taking the line for a walk had all these kinds of sets of association. And walking in the studio, firstly, it's a way of procrastination, of not having to actually get down to the drawing. The drawing is there, but there's maybe half an hour of walking around the studio, gathering the energy to start the drawing. And I kind of think of it, when I'm optimistic, as a productive procrastination, because thoughts are going. But you have a peripheral vision of everything that's in the studio, all the things that are up on the wall. And the hope is that as you're walking, there's both the peripheral vision, but also a kind of peripheral thinking of different ideas starting to coalesce until you finally make the drawing. But the walking is also, walking is itself. There's so many different things to think about in walking. Walking is always sort of falling and catching yourself from falling and falling. But the ways that people walk, and it's both there as an animator, you're constantly aware of what are the attitudes, what are the way that things are moving to see it, and which comes into the animation or into the attitudes of people in performance. But I mean, just, there's some people who, when they walk, they're led by their chest, and you see them, they walk and their chest is leading them, or they're led by their head, people walk and their head is, or by their knees, some people walk and their knees are, or they walk from the hips, from the pelvis. So all of those different things, which are things that one recognizes, even if you couldn't predict them in advance. And so I think the studio needs to be a space where, even if you don't know what you're doing, even if you don't have a theme, there's an openness to what comes towards you.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe briefly visit another topic of your work and in this show, because it's rarely been seen, and those are some of the very early drawings from the mid-80s. And this is really a chance to look at these, because they are gathered from lots of distant collections, mostly in South Africa. And so how is it for you, and you mentioned this, to see them like after 30 years, some of them you haven't seen yourself in many decades, to see these early drawings? It's almost like a walk back into time, too.
So in the exhibition in the Gegenwart at the bottom of the hill, there's a room which very early on Joe just said, let's show work that hasn't been seen either at all or for a long time. And it was an excavation of drawing from 30 or 35 years ago. And there's some of them, when I look at them, think, oh my God, I knew what I was doing then. What's happened since? And the others that I think, oh, okay, good that we moved on from there. But they are interesting to see. They were also trying to find a form, a kind of a narrative form.
Triptych.
So a triptych, there are several which are triptychs. And then there are others which are a long arc of a horizon with people moving all along it. And in a way, when I see them now, I thought, of course, these are kind of a prehistory of a narrative animation. There are different frames or different ways of trying to find a passage of time in a static drawing.
Yeah. You mentioned the cat and the dog, and there's just an undefinable but beautiful range of creatures and one can see it here in your work. And there are also, there's an early drawing that I find really extremely fascinating and hard to explain. It's called the Conservationist's Ball. Culling, game watching, taming. And obviously, this relates to animals. And there are three animals, I think. There's a cheetah, in Gepard. There is a rhinoceros, and I think it's a
dog, a police dog.
And it's a hyena.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Hyena. And the hyena is a very mysterious animal. So when they show up again and again in your works, I mean, the rhinoceros it's an amazing. I mean, it's just a world wonder that it still exists, this animal among us. We haven't destroyed it yet. So how, can you say something about these? You mentioned the cat, the dog, the hyena. It comes up until now.
I mean, I did a list earlier last year of a list of things I have drawn, a long list, and then a list of things I have not drawn. And of course, cat, dog, rhinoceros were on the one list. And then there were others, and various, other things, typewriter, megaphone, witch, modernist house, all of these were on lists that I've drawn, and then there were other things like, on the other side, hippopotamus, creme brulee, different things which I'd never made a drawing of. And I said, all right, for a while, I'm only allowed to draw from this list. We have to do, there's been so many rhinoceri. There's been more than one rhinoceros. That I tried to draw from that list. But halfway through the first hippopotamus, I decided, no, I'd rather draw the 700th rhinoceros. So it's not as easy as simply saying all of these things can be drawn. It's what you need to draw, what's possible. And that list But that kind of bestiary is...
Yeah, bestiarium.
I mean,
yeah.
in South Africa, I mean, the rhinoceros came in the film like Mine and in other things. We have the game reserves in which animals are, which are in fact, where you go to see wildlife, which are in fact the tamest and the safest places in the country. You can go there, you leave your door open at night in the Rondavel where you're sleeping, you drive around without any anxiety. When you're in the cities, there's much more residual anxiety, checking over your shoulder at every stop street, being much more aware of being vulnerable at night. And so there's a kind of a recreational danger of going to the game reserves, to enjoy the frisson of the elephant coming towards you but not quite reaching you. So the animals partly came in as a comment on that, on the domestication of nature. Mm. And of course it's very different now. When that drawing was done 35 years ago, rhinoceroses were being bred and there were a healthy population in South Africa. In the last decade particularly, I think with increasing wealth in the far east, the rhinoceros horn is seen as an elixir of life in certain forms of traditional medicine. And the price paid for a piece of rhinoceros horn is so huge now that the poaching is almost unstoppable. And there's a very real danger that they will become extinct very, 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 very shortly. The last rhinoceros in Cameroon of that subspecies went extinct, was poached about 3 years ago. Yeah. So that is a series. That wasn't the theme behind these, but it's one of the things that overlays it. And you think of this strange image from Dürer onwards that sits in our unconsciousness, to Ionesco's play, to the Longi rhinoceros at the Venice Carnival. It's so overladen with different things that had to be in there.
Let's maybe move to the early films. As already said, we really tried in this show to focus on things that have rarely been seen. And early drawings, we already mentioned, but there's also early films, very early films, so the beginning of the animation, the animated film. And I think one of them, it's called Exhibition. Many of you may not know it so well. It's from 1987, and I think it's quite radical what you did there, if I understand it correctly, because you had first of all, no script, no story, nothing. And you used, if I understand, and that's why it's called Exhibition, the people entering the room became the material for the film. Can you say something?
So there was an exhibition that when I was starting in the mid-1980s that traveled around South Africa, and one of the places it went to was a small provincial gallery in Pietermaritzburg, a town close to Durban in South Africa. And there the agreement was that I would do a project in the museum, and that took the form of making a stop frame animation. And I said, well, we'll put the camera up, and whoever comes into the gallery will be part of the film. So there's school groups that come in, there are other visitors that come in, and I'd get them to look closely at pictures, to move away, to erase drawings as I'd done them. And it was just at the stage, I think it was the second film that I'd made, of discovering what was possible. So it had the first moments of charcoal drawing and erasure and drawing and erasure. And it's not a film that I generally show.
Yeah. And it's something to see, because you haven't seen it, and it really gives a great introduction to. So you see this work here, which is one of the, I think, really breathtaking pieces that William has done not so long ago, 2015. It's called More Sweetly Play the Dance. It's sort of the end room in the show, and it's a very large and very powerful piece with sound, and we are coming back to foot power and to marches and all of that. So the procession also. What is the procession is a way of. It's an old ritualistic way of human behavior. Has been tied to religion in many ways, but of course it's also a symbol of many things. It can be a symbol of resistance. The marches that Gandhi has initiated actually in South Africa and in India, the Salt March. I mean, all these streams of people who take their own freedom, even if they're not allowed, and they go where they want to go. And so procession, marches, this is kind of a time we live in too, no? I mean, we all talk about migration and all those things, but here it's never sort of, it doesn't illustrate anything political. It's more like an allegory almost of. Can you say something about the procession?
About the processions and the more sweetly play the dance. So I think you're right that it doesn't have a specific agenda, but it's filled with so many different sets of associations. So just to talk about some of those which were into it. So the title, More Sweetly Plays the Dance, is a kind of a reworking of the Paul Celan poem about Death is a Master from Germany, about the Holocaust, and play death more sweetly is a line in the poem. But it also relates to the idea of the dance of death. And of course, in Basel, one of the great examples of the dance of death is there. And that was a medieval form of showing the power of death, that you'd see death together with everyone, death with the Pope, with the king, with the bishop, with the priest, with the farmer, with the child. In other words, everyone was going to die. And it was a kind of a moral lesson at the time of the plague. So you would have the plague, and there was this dance of death that would take you. But there was also a counter story that if you danced non-stop in your village, if you kept dancing as the plague was approaching, if you didn't stop dancing, the plague would pass you by and go on to the next village. So that was also a kind of dance of death, a dance against death, which is there when we did this piece. It's really about people carrying shadows and walking across my studio while we film them, many times. And sometimes we tried it fast, sometimes we tried it slow, sometimes a very measured walk, sometimes quite an exaggerated walk where you push with your back leg as you take a step to kind of feel a weight. So it becomes a series of practical, all of these questions of memory, history, migration, all those things, break down into a series of practical questions, not even formal questions, like what is it that someone carrying it does not look right? Is it because they're leaning too far backwards, or they're leaning too far forwards, or the pressure is... So that is what we're primarily looking at. But as it comes together, we've got different pieces of music. A brass band, we've brought a brass band into the studio and had them play, and they played different kinds of music, something that was quite up-tempo, something that was a real funeral march. And the real funeral march made the piece almost static. It slowed everything down so much. And we found when we'd had the walking, which we'd done to the rhythm of a funeral march, but played it against a much more strange up-tempo brass band piece with accordion, it suddenly took off in a different way. And then there are other sets. Obviously, you can see here, this was made in the era of the big Ebola outbreak in West Africa, when these images of people in hazmat suits and other people with their drips was on all our newspapers as a kind of contemporary plague. But then one could say, okay, is it even further back? Is it a kind of a vestigial memory? Here in Basel itself, in 1329, the plague arrived. And one of the beliefs was that the plague had been brought to Basel by the Jews in Basel. So 600 Jews were put into a small church, and the church was set on fire, and the 600 people burned to death. And then Jews were thrown out of Basel till 1529. So in other words, years after Erasmus was writing in praise of Folly. This is something I only discovered 3 years after making the piece. But I think when I see it here, it suddenly has that other kind of echo. So it's both people carrying their lives on their shoulders, the bath, the typewriter, and continuing on the basis that everything could get into it while it was being filmed. And then when being edited, there'd be a great carefulness to see what it felt like as it expanded and as we moved people about or slowed it down.
And I think maybe let's just clarify one thing, because you just mentioned the studio again, but this is of course a different studio.
Okay.
There are two studios. There's the one we saw at the very beginning, which is really the kind of the brain of the artist. It's a physical space where lots of people come in and out, but there's a much larger studio in downtown Johannesburg where these things are then implemented, tested, and what's beautiful there too. There's fantastic dancers. There's wonderful musicians. Everybody here performing is an individual. It's not just a kind of an anonymous shadow. These people are all individuals, and I think the way you bring the beauty of each movement of this which is different out is a great talent that you seem to be able to produce when you rehearse in your larger studio.
I think that none of the scripts or none of these performances have none of the films and none of the performances like this have a script or a storyboard. So the only way they're going to be rescued is by things that happen in front of you on the studio. So there's a huge reliance on the brilliance and inventiveness of the collaborators. In this case, the musical performers, the dancers, the actors, to find things that. So it's very much about what's inside them as well. And some of them would be, I remember a dance that my grandfather used to do when he came back from the war, and that would be something that would come in. There was a woman who played a stenographer in More Sweetly Play the Dance, and the revelation was the way she would tuck her skirt in as she sat down on the typist's chair. And it was like that moment, okay, that's the moment that we want, that gives us a whole new character in it. There were two actors who'd been acting in a different piece for me together, and they became a kind of a politician and his translator. And they'd worked together so many times that just say, all right, I want a political speech and a crazy translation, and it takes off without having to direct every moment of it. And that's partly the result of working with the same people for, in some cases, many decades, and other people on many projects. So it's a mixture of familiar people coming back and back and back, and new people coming into the studio.
How are we on time? I'm sorry, but just so we know.
I think we've got about 20 minutes.
Okay, so because there's at least two things we would love to talk about, and because many of you have heard about The Head and the Load. The Head and the Load is certainly one of the most ambitious projects that William has done a year ago. It was a big multi-media performance theater production in the Tate Modern. Sort of on a very large stage, 60 meters long, with lots of people, musicians, dancers, performers, singers, and so on. And of course, that's a very smooth transition from this piece into The Head and the Load. So I think it would be good to just talk briefly about that piece, because the history, again, behind The Head and the Load is a suppressed history, is a history that we don't know much about in Europe. It's it's a stolen history of Africa, because the First World War started in Africa, not in France or Germany. It started in Africa, and millions of Africans were used as carriers and as kind of low personnel to perform in that war, and many died. So it is the first time that it has been highlighted by a major work of art.
So The Head and the Load is a theater performance, 60 performers or 50 performers on this very wide stage, and the historical material is about Africa in the First World War. And although, of course, the large battles were fought in Europe, the first shots in the First World War were in fact fired in Togo in Africa just before. And the war in Africa ended 2 weeks after the armistice in Germany. And there were 1 million casualties in Africa, mainly civilians, and the rest carriers. So that is what it's about. But again, to say it started off, as you say, coming out of this thinking, we've got a long stage, we can do something processional, we can work with shadows that change scale as we do it. Let's work with a mixture of European high modernism, Ravel, Satie, Hindemith, and African choral traditions, and the strategies of Dada, of things that don't make sense, of languages that don't make sense, of incomprehension. And as we were doing that and mapping that onto this question of the history, it became a new way of thinking about history, not as a coherent single line, but saying, can one make something that still has a strong argument or strong meaning, even if it is made out of these different fragments, and we resist the impulse towards a lecture? And that was the challenge, and I think in many ways it's trying to find, how do you show the history in the body? So, for example, there's this paradox of colonialism at the time of the First World War, which compresses the history of colonialism. That was, do I demand the right to go and die in this French war? Is that my right to be seen as a citizen? I should also be able to make a harvest of devotion, as it was described. We offer a harvest of devotion, was what one of the African leaders said to France, to try to be allowed to fight in the war. And others like John Chilembe said, no, if this is a war of rich men in Europe, let the bankers and storekeepers go to war and get shot. Why should we die when we're just going to leave a long line of widows and orphans? And so how does one, where does that, how is that shown? And it was, in fact, by working with one of the dancers in a dance piece of his I'd seen elsewhere, where he had an extraordinary control of what his chest was doing, so that in a sense his body would be going one way, but he'd be receding as he did it. I can't begin to do it because you need to be Gregory Makoma. And so it was a way of trying to find, as we watched him in improvisations, in repeating things he'd done in a different dance piece, suddenly became the medium of thinking about that paradox, that spasm of history. When you want to go and don't go, is your desire to be accepted by Europe, to resist Europe? And I think that was the key thing, trying to find all the different things in sound, in language, that would do it. And it does end up as a piece about Africa in the First World War.
And by the way, it is, so you wonder, how does this end up in our show? Because it's a performance, you can't, and it does end up in the first time that the museum, we can show this piece in a room, one room installation. It is in the Gegenwart also. Kaboom it's called, and it's, of course, it's a summary. If it's kind of a synthesis now of the.
It's a shortened piece of video, but what it is, to work on these kind of big performances, not to work on something that's that extensive, 60 meters. We certainly can't do that in the studio. So all the video work and the thinking about it is done on a maquette in the other studio, in the small studio, and what is on exhibition at the museum called Kaboom is that maquette, on which we were thinking about the sequence of projections and the sound and what it could be. So there are no actors in it, it's just projections and sound, but it's the form of the...
So it really condenses, it's a condensed version of this very, very beautiful and piece. Now, our exhibition is called A Poem That Is Not Our Own. And we discussed the title of the show. There's many beautiful fragments of poem-like fragments that one can take from William's work, so there's never a problem to find a beautiful title. But this is also from this piece, The Head and the Load. Oh, maybe you should briefly mention the African proverb, the head and the load.
Okay, so the piece is called The Head and the Load, which is this fragment of an African proverb, which is, the head and the load are the troubles of the neck. And of course, here it's both a physical load that carriers carried, and it's a historic load, and it's a psychic load. But the phrase comes from that proverb.
So I feel strongly about that title as being a kind of a programmatic title that says something about, even beyond this show, about the art today. What is the role of the art today? A poem that is not our own. I mean, would anyone think that when a poet wrote a poem, like Rilke wrote a poem, or I don't know, would he ever have thought this poem was himself? Of course not. Art, and I think great art is can never be confined to one person, and in that regard, not even owned. And so I think this idea of a kind of a collective history, a poem that is not our own, is, I think, a beautiful indication of the scope and of this work, which I think is outstanding. Now, we need to talk about something quite sensational also, which is your new Soho film. A mouth is dreaming.
So the series of animation, charcoal animation, started in 1989, so it's 30 years of making them, and this is the 11th film in the series. And they all use the same technique of drawing and erasing, drawing and erasing in charcoal, so they're kind of getting back to basics each time I come back to making the film. And this one, the current one, which is still a work in progress, is very much about the informal economy in South Africa and the collapse of public institutions of the Johannesburg Art Gallery. But it's still at the stage of different images coming together that I'm trying to see what it will mean at the end. And so there's one kind of sense of it as it exists. And I wish it would change radically in the next section, but I suspect it's going to be a development of what we've seen and not fundamentally.
So, in order,
it's very, just to talk about showing a work in progress.
Right.
The film is always a kind of, or a drawing is always a kind of a membrane. There's, in itself and as a demonstration of the world. Obviously, what happens when we see anything, we recognize different shapes and see different shapes, or we see a set of charcoal marks, and onto this we project from ourselves a whole set of associations that spread out. So you see an image of a rhinoceros, and coming towards it from you is Dürer's rhinoceros and other photos you've seen in other drawings. So it's always this mixture of the biographical and the world coming, and they meet on this plane, which in this case is the screen of the film which it is shown. So in a way, it's useful for me to see the film through other people's eyes, watching them watch the film.
I think it's a great privilege for us to actually almost enter the studio with this presentation, because the film is not done yet, and yet no one would guess, I didn't when I saw the film, that it's not finished. It's a beautiful work of art. As I said, the title is The Mouth is Dreaming, and it is also in our show. Maybe because music is so important in your work, can you, William, one thing I always wonder about, when does music come into the creative process? You know, obviously drawing is and then moving around and having people come into your studio and moving out, and you've worked with lots of great people, dancers and theater people and technical people, but also with lots of wonderful musicians from Africa. You've used classical music, Shostakovich, Alban Berg, Hindemith, on and on. And when does music sort of come in? When does it start to inform what you do?
So the music is vital. In a project like More Sweetly Play the Dance, when I had a sense of people carrying shapes and moving, I looked through YouTube at 1,000 different brass bands from around Johannesburg and found one that I really loved the look of, and then we spent a month trying to track down where this brass band came from. It was just a sort of cell phone clip of, and brass bands are always church brass bands in South Africa, till we found the brass band. Brass bands are owned by their bishops. So if you want to start a new church in South Africa, and there are many, many, you can proclaim yourself a bishop, and you gather people around you, and then you need to buy the uniforms and the instruments, and then you have a brass band, and you own that brass band. So we'd found this great brass band, but we had to not just find the band, we had to find the bishop to negotiate with, to get the band to come and play in this piece, which was about death with skeletons, to ensure him it was not devil worship we were involved with. But so very early on, when the brass band came into the studio and started playing, we knew there was something astonishing. I think it had to do with the sound of a brass band in an enclosed space, which was wonderful. But sometimes the music comes with the animation. That's so slow to do the animation that maybe a month or 2 months after starting it, I'll start with a composer. If I'm working with someone like Philip Miller, we'll start looking at the images and listening to different kinds of music, his music, other people's music, to find what the music does to what you are seeing. Because it both can set a mood, but it can also change the speed that the film is moving at. It can give a kind of a punctuation, a grammar to the film, what causes what came before something else, what's a memory, what's happening now. So it has a very grammatical part also. We do a concert on Thursday and Friday at the theatre behind the Tangley Fountain in the center of the town, called Paper Music, which is 17 songs written by Philip Miller and 17 films that I've made for those songs, and great singers, Joanna Dudley and Anne Messina, 2 singers and a piano.
So
And
if you didn't know about this, there are places still at the Theater Basel to go to twice. I think it's at 8 o'clock Thursday and Friday, and it's something not to be missed in case you didn't know about it.
And so some of those were films that existed, which Philip has rewritten music for. Some of them were an idea we had. What happens if we do a kind of calligraphic painting, and the singers use that as their score? So in fact, we did it twice. First, they improvised singing, and I was listening to them and painting as they sang to get a sense of it. And then we filmed the paper, which was now painted, being pulled in front of them, a long scroll, and they then performed to that. And we had one scroll for the piano and one scroll each for the 2 singers. So the concordance or dissonance is made by the different sheets of paper coming. So that's kind of the drawing and the music and the performance completely intertwined.
Great. I assume we must be close to 10 o'clock, which...
11 o'clock, yes.
11 o'clock, yeah?
Yes, I think.
I believe there's a question, some questions are encouraged, so...
But we have time for, as much time we have. We're happy to answer questions, but it's also not essential. I think so. There's one question here, yes.
I have 2 questions.
Can you speak up?
No, and we'll repeat them. You say the questions,
Okay.
I'll repeat them. Yes.
First, my name is Will Fortman from the Netherlands, and I enjoyed your show Kunstmuseum Basel. And when I saw the parade with the shadows,
Okay, so this is a question, and maybe I think we are running out of time, so I'll talk about this one briefly, and then we must probably have to stop the formal structure. And it's about this. It's about the shadows, and these are silhouettes or shadows that you say. Is this about Plato? Plato's allegory of the cave, and it's the right question because it's very central to what's happened in the studio for years and years. The great allegory of the cave is that prisoners sit in darkness, chained in the cave, and ahead of them they see the shadows of puppets that are being carried behind a wall by people carrying the puppets. This is written 2,500, 3,000 years ago. And these people, if they're chained like that, would assume that those shadows are reality. And then the allegory, which is about the philosopher, is someone loosening their chains and taking them out. And if they came out into the sunlight, they'd first be blinded by the light, and then they'd realize that those were only shadows, and what they were seeing in the real world was the truth. And it's the fundamental myth of Western civilization, which is about going from darkness into light. The whole Enlightenment, all the kind of projects that Europe described to itself of going to the dark continent and bringing people into light, have that echo of Plato's cave. And so a lot of the work I do about shadows is about what you learn from shadows and how blinded you are by the light and how different layers of reality there are. And there's some things you can see in a shadow that you will never see when you're looking at a real object. But also, in a way, I think of these people not as the prisoners in the cave who Plato writes about, or the people led out into the sunlight, but the people mentioned in passing, but which are essential for this whole edifice of this metaphor to work. And those are the anonymous carriers who spend their lives carrying the shadows behind the wall for all the prisoners in order for the other people to learn their enlightenment. So it's kind of the even more unspoken crowds than he has. So yes, it's an echo afterwards. But having said all of that, that is an understanding I came to years after making the films using shadows and things with them.
And by the way, there is another piece called Shadow Procession, which is in the Neubau. So the show works on different levels, and I should mention this because maybe most of you will not realize. So there's the main show is in der Gegenwart. Then there is the old building where that we showed in the very beginning, the learning from the old masters. There's Shadow Procession, a very beautiful piece in the Gegenwart, sort of on the basement. In the basement, and then at night, this is the first time that an artist has used our LED freeze. So after 9 o'clock or so, you will see text fragments. Maybe you could say just a few words about the context of this piece.
There's this beautiful strip around the Neubau, which usually advertises the exhibitions and has information. But they said, come and do something with it. So I worked with the video editor Janus Fouché, who's done many projects in the exhibition, and constructed a piece which is a kind of a concrete poem. It uses the text from a libretto of an opera we're working on in the future. It's about predicting the future, and this fragment is about the machine remembering for us, about the algorithm taking over the role of the Sibyl or the prophet. But it was a very beautiful material to work in. So,
maybe another question?
No,
someone different.
Sorry, actually it's two questions also. So regarding what we talked about the light and shadow, and like about death, the dance of death, can you make some comments about like before God said there shall be light? So about like a voyage au bout de nuit, or carrying a candle in the darkness, and about the dance of death. What do you think about Capetown and the Death and the Maiden, this topic, because you made the film Lulu? Thank you.
Okay, the only thing I'll say about death is about the metaphors of science. And that's an interesting place where poetry and physics meet. And that is when we did a project about the refusal of time, there was a section of it which was about, in it was about the history of time. And of course, we know that everything heads towards a black hole where gravity is so huge that it will swallow everything, and that everything around it gets swallowed by the black hole and nothing escapes again. And there's a debate in science between scientists with Stephen Hawking, and I think that's the one that's won in the debate since that argument began, about what happens to all information that goes into a black hole. Is it lost forever? And some people say in terms of the laws of entropy that can't happen. And so in fact the information about whatever gets sucked into a black hole spins around the edge of the black hole as strings of information. And that theoretically all this information can be reconstituted. So that's kind of the deep science, that's the scientific argument with all the mathematics that goes with those arguments. But of course, if one thinks of it in the other term, it's the age-old debate. We're all heading towards our own black hole, our 6-foot hole, our own private grave. And the debate that's been going for all these decades and millennia is about, is that the end of us? Is nothing going to remain? Is it or not? And some people say, no, there has to be some kind of soul that's going to wait to be resurrected. So the scientists think they're doing deep science, but it cannot escape the much less precise formulations that we've all had in us about this resistance to believing this complete annihilation. And the mathematicians, of course, say that, no, the physicists are just poets because their mathematics is so bad. There's not a single physicist that knows what they're talking about mathematically. And there are other mathematicians that say, no, there isn't a single one of the deep mathematical proofs that go on for pages and pages and pages that's ever been replicated and checked. Every long mathematical proof has found its fault. So I think that's a long answer to your question, but it's kind of, it gives comfort in the studio to think, well, I'm just drawing people in a piece of black charcoal, but it's not disconnected to all of these other questions.
Right.
I think we should stop. I think people are ready to go. Okay.
Stop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.